Hi, welcome back to Next Third, Best Third. I'm David Fenwick. I'm the founder and host. And today we've got an incredible interview, an incredible guest. And specifically, if you're a time and a place of your life where you find yourself really just trying to make sense of it all. Maybe you found yourself and you're like, this is not what I signed up for. And you're trying to figure out, is there really hope in the middle of this? How do I get out of this? What steps do I take? This podcast, this episode is for you. And this morning I get to interview my new friend. We've gotten to know each other for over just the last few weeks, Trevor Duffy. Trevor is an amazing, amazing guy. He's got a new book out on Amazon. We're going to give you the link below. And it's called Broken for a Purpose.
Yeah.
So Trevor, welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for having me here, and I just honor you for doing this. I think it's great.
Well, thanks for taking time. I know you're on a vacation, and this was not planned, but when I found out you were in town, I said, I got to have you here. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you.
So just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I'm married and have two boys. We live in Nashville, Tennessee, and my wife's amazing. My boys are wild. They're 5 and 2. But yeah, I just, like you said, I wrote a book called Broken for a Purpose. It was just kind of a God idea one day, trying to figure out how to live on the other side of trauma and how to kind of walk as a man on an earth that so often discounts men or tells us we need to be something that we're really not created for.
Right.
But other than that, I grew up in a small town in Oregon, born and raised there, loved parts of it, didn't like others, probably like most people. But yeah, I kind of lived a long life in a short amount of years. I'm 28, so I've experienced a lot and I've walked through a lot, and hopefully we can talk kind of about that today on this podcast. But yeah, I love Jesus, and I want to help other men learn that you can live a life that's worth living.
Right. Yeah. So much of Next Third, Best Third is we're really kind of digging deep into what it is to really be a man, right? Yeah. Because there's so many narratives out there, what a man is supposed to be. And I so appreciate that you went there right away. Yeah. And as I was reading through your book, I could see the thread through it all, right? Identity is such a big thing.
Yeah, for sure. The most important thing.
Right. And so often we get our identity. I was thinking about this before coming here this morning, is that, so often a man gets his value from what he does, right? What he does, what he produces, what he has. And really you get to a place where you start to ask yourself a question. You started asking it in your 20s. Yeah. A lot of the people who are listeners and followers, they're much older than you, twice as old as you. And still asking those questions is, when is enough enough? When have I done enough to qualify, right? When have I done enough? And so, I meet men all the time who they said, I don't feel like I've done enough. And it's all tied to performance.
Yeah. I think that's passed down from generation to generation. I think many years ago, for some reason, men were valued for what they can bring to the table, what they can provide for a wife and kids. And I think while those are, yes, a part of your call as a man, I do believe, I don't think that's where you get your value from, your innate value. And so, yeah, I just think identity, like you said, is the foundation and the cornerstone, right? When we know that we get our identity from the Creator himself, the one that laid the foundations of the earth in the very beginning, then we don't have to live our life out of performance and always having this question of, are we enough? But we can walk in a victor stance and know that we have value, whether we provide enough, whether we perform enough, whether we have the things that we want. While these are all not bad things, if you get your identity from them, then that's when they can become very detrimental.
Yeah, yeah. I want you to dig a little bit and reveal kind of your journey, right? How you came, because you made mention and alluded to how it's a generational thing so often is passed down to us as far as what a man's supposed to be, what a man's not supposed to be. And I'm not a big proponent of going back and digging up the graves and the bones of our fathers and grandfathers and, looking at it and blaming them. But there is something that comes to us and comes through to us from the generations, right? So tell us a little bit about where you found your identity being perverted or lost and, not your true identity. You're believing lies.
Yeah, so like I said, I grew up in a small town in Oregon. My great-great-grandfather settled the town came across on the Oregon Trail from, I think, Michigan. And so that town, I knew everybody. My parents knew everybody. They're either related to me or they've been there for a long time. So it's kind of like a big family. And my father, I talk a lot about it in my book, but my father is the son of a immigrant woman from Mexico. And his dad was a handyman, did a lot of work. And so he was born in California, and then they moved up to Oregon, and then he met my mother up there. But my dad, the further I looked into his journey and kind of why he was the way he was as a child, when I was a child, was he too was marked by adversity, And, when he was young, 12, 13 years old, his parents left and told him, hey, we're leaving. We paid the rent for 2 months, and then you're on your own. And
so 12 years old?
Yeah. I think it was 12 or 13, yeah. And so my dad, from a very young age, had to learn to produce, and had to perform to be able to create something for himself. And, they weren't religious. My dad didn't know anything about, creator, creation, or anything like that. It was, I'm on my own now. And so, he put himself through high school and would work. He would tell me stories about getting up early, riding his bike 6 or 7 miles down to catch a bus so he could go pick strawberries and then ride the bus back. And then once he got back, he would do a evening paper route and then would go work at the gas station and then would wake up, do a paper route, ride his bike, strawberries. And I'm like, that's not a great life as a kid.
No, that's incredible. I mean, he's truly what we'd call a self-made man, but that's not a good thing.
Yeah, not a good thing in this instance. And so, he graduated high school, went to college. He was the first one in his family to go to college, got 2 master's degrees, and became a nurse and a teacher. And he was phenomenal in his trade. But he grew up that way, and then he was in a mass shooting when he was a teacher up in Thurston, Oregon. And after that, from the stories that I hear from my brothers and sisters, that's kind of when he changed. And that happened in 96, so that was the year I was born. And so my dad went through that, saved a bunch of lives, met the president, all that. And, at the time, I didn't know that. I didn't know the story, growing up, and I didn't know the struggle he lived with. And so, as I grew up in a home that was oppressed by a lot of rage and a lot of anger. And, now when I talk to my dad, I can understand that, right? I can understand the things that he had to live with and go through. And, sorry. But yeah, so I know what he had to live through and go through. But as a child, like I said, I grew up in a rage and anger, and I did not enjoy my childhood. The beatings and the words that were burned into my brain of the negativity that he would call us, and just some really painful things.
Did your older siblings, prior to the shooting, right, prior to the mass shooting and what he went through, did they experience that rage prior to that, or is it something that was really introduced afterwards?
I think my dad was always kind of stern and harsh, just because his dad was. But as I talk to my siblings, I have 7 siblings. I'm the youngest of eight kids. It got exponentially worse after that. You know, my dad, his firstborn son was killed in a car accident. My mom was actually in labor, called my dad and was like, hey, I'm going to drive myself into town. And my dad was like, no, like, I'll come get you. And she's like, no, it's fine. I'm good, you know. So she was driving in town from her house out 18 miles out in the wilderness. And, you know, she drove that road every day for, I don't know, 20, 30 years. And as she was coming into town, a drunk driver that was on a bender all night was driving home and was going about 120 miles an hour and blew through the corner and tore my mom's car in half. And so my dad got a call that my mom was at the hospital, and so he showed up. And when he walked in, you know, he told me this story. When he walked in, they were like, hey, we need you to go essentially see your son before we take care of him. And so he walked in the room, and, you know, his firstborn son, he saw laying there. And, you know, he told me he didn't really know what to do, because when something like that happens, your brain doesn't know how to comprehend it in the moment, I don't think. And so he left there, walked across the hallway, and my mom was there. She was in surgery for hours, and I think she died on the table like 6 times. Pretty much just ripped her in half. And so they had to sew her all back up together. And so he had a lot of pain and trauma in his life. And so fast forward, the shooting happened, and yeah, he was consumed by rage. And he would tell you this, you know, if he was sitting here in front of you. And so up into my teens, I was 14 years old, and my sister was killed in a car accident, road rage. A lady was in a rush in a construction zone and tried to pass my sister where the cones opened up for a turnoff and hit her in the front right fender and shot my sister in oncoming traffic, and she got killed, got hit head on by a truck. And so, you know, I talk about all that in my book, but all this saying, you know, when you talk about from generation to generation, my dad didn't have the tools he never was taught or didn't learn how to express his emotion and, you know, in a healthy way or go find help. Because I think nowadays, and especially back then, you know, my dad's 68. You know, back then it was like men need to be strong, they need to be tough, they don't have emotion, they don't get to connect with their emotion, they're not vulnerable, they're not, right, you know, anything like that. It's, well, we'll wake up the next day and we'll keep going. Yeah,
that's that false narrative about what masculinity is supposed to look like.
Correct. And so he didn't know how to process any of that. And so sadly what it does is it creates us to live in a prison of silence. And when I realized that, that's why my book is called Broken for a Purpose, Poetic Path from Silence to Liberation, is I believe that men are trapped in silence, and the only way that things come out is either destructive behavior or anger.
In your introduction, that caught me, the word silence just jumped out in one of the paragraphs. And you associated that with digging deep, right? You remember that part. Go into that just a little bit, because I really talk a lot about isolation, you know, and how dangerous isolation is. And when you were talking about men can easily get into this prison of silence. Yeah. I just want to explore that a little bit. I think there's real power
so kind of like I just said, right, where it's, you know, at least how I grew up, it was I never saw my dad cry. I never saw my dad have really any other emotion besides his happiness. You know, he was really, really great with a relationship outside our home. And so I saw him that way, or I saw him raged and angered and just didn't have a lightness to him at all. And it was such a drastic view that I saw him in those two ways. And so what that taught me is being secluded might be a good thing, right? And so in my book, I talk a lot about how we can be lied to from the enemy, where men feel like we need to be secluded and we need to be silent. And a lot of times it's a trust thing, right? I can't trust anybody else because I've never seen it go in a good direction when someone's vulnerable or something. And it really exposes our ego. And so I think being trapped in silence is living a life as a man where you think you have to deal with it on your own, and you think you have to take these things and almost absorb them. And when you absorb them, when I realized this whole situation, I actually got a vision where I was laying in a grave and these things were happening to me, and to prevent myself from feeling like I was dying, I was essentially covering myself up with dirt, to where I would be in this place of seclusion and no one could touch me, no one could see me, I could just be on my own thing. But then I kind of realized that once I covered myself up, I couldn't breathe, I couldn't move, I couldn't have any relationship or anything. And so it kind of opened my eyes to realize that silence and seclusion is the death of a man.
Yes.
And so
I agree 100%. We talk about in Next Third, Best Third about fighting 5 areas of decay. Yeah. And one of those areas is relationships. And men, as they not just get older, because obviously you learned it at a very young age, men so often fail to really nurture relationships because there's a vulnerability there for a healthy relationship. So we can have a counterfeit or something that's kind of fills a void, guys just rallying around sports or rallying around some sort of a project or something like that, instead of really getting to know one another. And, we need men, right? We need great relationships with our spouses, right? Yeah. But we need men who we can be vulnerable with. And that is not easy, and it's not common.
Yeah, not at all. And that kind of shows, like, men want to be around men. Yeah. We just don't know how to be around men without having, I talk a lot about your ego, where it's like I hate this when I show up to somewhere and it's like the first question you get, it's asked, like, what do you do for a living?
That's right.
Or like, hey, my name's Trevor, what do you do for a living? And it's like, well, I'm a construction superintendent and I build things for a living. And what it does is it creates a surface level relationship.
That's right.
And it's so hard once you create that to start really diving into it. And obviously for, men on men, you have to build trust to be able to be vulnerable. But I think when you get your identity and your value from God and you realize that from the beginning of time and creation, we're created for relationship. Right? The only thing God said wasn't good was man being alone.
That's right.
And so,
and that's not just about having a partner,
correct,
a spouse or a life partner, right?
And I don't think God would have given us a spouse or a life partner if he didn't know that we were going to multiply and there was going to be relationships of all kinds, right?
That's right.
And so, yeah, so sorry.
No, that's okay. One of the things that I wanted to bring up is I was having a discussion with a group of guys this week, and you touched on it about when you go and you meet somebody and the very first question is, what do you do, right? Yeah. And our identity can so often be tied, as I said at the beginning, to what we do, how much we earn, and our successes. But on the flip side of that, where shame and guilt and failure comes in, is I don't do what I really want to do. I'm not earning what I should, and I'm focused on my failures. That's the same coin. It's just different sides of the same coin, and it's all based on performance.
For sure.
And that's the trap that men fall in, right? And I love the fact that you have, with intentionality, are addressing the importance of vulnerability in masculinity.
Yeah. That's good. Yeah, I think when I talk about vulnerability, there's a combination of seeing it in our past or seeing it where we feel like we can't trust people with the deepest parts of ourselves. And there's a thing inside of our heads that I call the ego, where it's like, if you're vulnerable, you're not going to be good enough, or your status is going to be taken from you, or, whatever happens. And so I think there's a combination of having introspection enough to say, no, if I'm vulnerable with this person, if I create a relationship, it doesn't automatically mean he's going to hurt me, or I'm going to be exposed enough for somebody to kill parts of me, right? And for me, it was a lot of trauma in my past, sexual assault by a man when I was a young boy, being raped for 6 months, and having to go through all of the legal stuff of that. And then my dad, we had a poor relationship that kind of blew up. And so for me, being vulnerable with men was a really hard thing to do, because there was so many men that I could think about in my life that really hurt me and took parts of me. And so I think the first place you got to really start is forgiveness, and when I first came to Christ, his number one thing was forgiveness. I mean, for like a year and a half, I focused on, what does forgiveness mean? And forgiveness is giving up your right to take a pound of flesh back when someone takes a pound from you. Oh. And at least that's what he told me. Mm-hmm. And what it is realizing that God doesn't work out of lack. He doesn't work out of, everything that's on earth currently right now is all that we have, right? What science tells us, matters matter. No one can create, no one can take it away. Matters matter, but God can create it, right? So when you get to a point where your relationships that you have, it's not, hey, I can give you this, but you need to give me this back. It's not an exchange, but it's a river flowing through us, right? When he talks about our cup runneth over, it means we have more than enough for other people to fill their cup. Right. And so for me, I really had to focus on forgiveness and to focus on, yes, this man when I was a kid took my innocence, took something from me. And it created a lot of pain and damage in my life. But now I know the Creator. I'm born again, right? I'm born again through baptism and through knowing the Holy Spirit and living a life like that. And what that did was it made me realize I don't have to take anything from somebody else to fulfill who I am as a person, right? It goes back to identity. God gives it to me as a gift, and he's the one that gets to push it and drive it and refill it and help you grow into who he needs you to be. And
you mentioned forgiveness, and I've heard it said that forgiveness is it's like a key that opens up the jail cell. Yeah. But the jail cell is actually letting you out. Right. It's for your freedom. Correct. Right. We think so often like, I'm not going to forgive that so-and-so for what he did, that guy who did this to me, or I'm not going to forgive. But what you're doing is you're imprisoning yourself, going back to something you spoke about earlier. And that forgiveness actually opens up the key for our freedom.
Yeah, correct. It's like, I see it kind of the same as service, right? Forgiveness and service are both based on the giver's heart. And it's putting us in a position in front of God where it's like, God, I'm not relying on him to give me what I need to be whole. I'm relying on you to give me what I need to be whole. Mm-hmm. I have a heart postured towards you so that I can show him love, right? I can show him you and me. Yeah. And the same as service, right? We don't qualify people. I think oftentimes we're like, I talk a lot because when I drive and I go do things, I'll give freely to homeless people that are asking for money. And people will be like, well, that's what they do all day. Like, that's just what they do, and that's how they make money, and that's their thing. And I'm like, but that's not my place to discern that, or to not to discern that, but to judge that, right?
Right.
I'm going to give because God puts it on my heart to give to people, and what he does with the money or what she does with the money is totally up to them. Maybe they are feeding their addiction. Maybe they are doing their thing, but that's not for me. I'm giving because God gave to me, and I have a heart for people.
It's so good. As you were speaking, I was thinking about, a lot of our followers and listeners aren't Christian. They don't have any kind of religious background or anything like that, or any faith necessarily. And but for a man to really be vulnerable, you have to get your source, you have to get your identity somewhere else. Because if I'm afraid to be vulnerable with you because you're going to either take something from me, reject me, mock me, right?
Yeah.
Then I'm looking at you to define me. Correct. And it's got to be beyond that, right? Otherwise, we're giving control to our employers, our peers. Right. We're getting our control to somebody else instead of, us being free.
Right. So, and that's giving more power than what you want to give anyway.
That's right.
Right. And so it's funny to me is once I realized that, where I was like, I don't want to be vulnerable to this person because I don't want them to give me my identity or give them the power to be over me or something. Then I realized that's exactly what I'm doing by stopping myself from being me and being able to be vulnerable to them. Because hopefully one day, right, why are we vulnerable? So that we can build a meaningful, lasting relationship, right? Cultivate relationship. Mm-hmm. That's one of the 5 things I talk about in my book, where it's like, as men, we're created to cultivate, right? Cultivate relationship with other people. And so when you realize that vulnerability is such a great place for a launching pad for a great relationship, and it doesn't have to be this scary thing where it's like, man, if I told this man that I'm addicted to porn and I, am struggling with that, he's going to think less of me. Well, that's on him, right?
That's right.
If he wants to think less of you because of that, that's on him.
Yeah.
But God sees you and saying like, hey, I need help, or hey, I need, this is something that I've struggled with, and like when someone comes to me and talks to me about it, that's the first thing I tell them is my testimony, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was addicted to porn from the age of 8 years old until 23, 24. And it's like, because in our testimony and realizing that, they can see and they can say, wow, I'm not the only one, right? A lot of people think, especially men, think that they're the only one that's gone through that.
That's right.
They're the only one that's made that bad decision. They're the only one that's walked out that life. And it's like, yeah, while you're on your own timeline and you've done your own things at different times or whatever, there's other men out there that have walked through the same thing. Might not be exactly the same in detail, but it's very similar, right?
Right.
And so when you realize that you're not this exception of chaos, then it's a lot easier for you to show up vulnerable.
So over the years, I've literally talked and gotten involved with thousands of men, right? That's just what I do. Thousands of men, I've heard their stories, and you're 100% right. I mean, all of them, without exception, have issues. They've been hurt, they've been wounded, they've been broken, they're carrying some pain with them, right? Yeah. And there are those times in those cases where there are addictions that are tied to physical things, right? Oh, yeah. But for the most part, we as men can focus on what we medicate with as if the medicating is the problem.
Yeah, for sure.
But that's not the problem, right? You medicate with porn, right? You medicate with drugs, you medicate with alcohol, you medicate with busyness, you medicate with all these different things, but the medicating is not really the problem.
Correct.
It's digging deep. We talk a lot about a life worth living is an examined life. And I love the fact that throughout your book, throughout really the 8 chapters, you really do talk about examining where you are and why you got there, right?
Yeah. It's not, because I think when I talk to people, their first thought is, well, I don't want to relive the trauma that I went through. And it's not so much reliving those things. It's having introspection enough to like I say this, right? Pain without introspection never turns to progress. So if you just have pain happen to you and you never look inside of you and say, how did this pain affect me? What am I carrying? How am I walking my life out? What triggers and traumas do I have that show anytime we get close enough to this pain, right? And so if you don't have this ability to look inside of yourself and realize, wow, I have this, anger or rage or trigger when it comes to my wife maybe talking to me in a certain way or with a certain tone that reminds me of my father, reminds me of my mother, it's like, then you'll never live a life that you're free from the pain of those traumas. Like, we all want to forget about them, but we can only move on if we realize that they have affected us in a way. Dig deep into yourself. Where am I sitting right now in time? And am I medicating myself to live another day? And if I am, usually it starts with, people focus, like you said, a lot on the medication, right? Whether it's pills, drugs, alcohol, porn, even the medication of addiction to pain, right? When you're going out and you're doing things that are painful to you and you know that, it's like an adrenaline release, right? And so when you can realize that you can separate those things, okay, well, I'm going to push those over here. What's lying behind that? What is that deep wound in me that is making me want those things? And, I talk about it a lot where usually the more layers you pull off, it always comes back to identity.
Yes.
It always comes back to, usually to when you were a boy or a girl, or when you felt exposed and you were hurt and it took something from your identity.
Yeah.
And so,
and there's so many times where there's a lie that's planted,
correct,
right? It's a
correct.
lie about your identity.
Correct.
You and I share some things similar as far as abuse as a child, and the lie that I believed was that I wasn't worth protecting.
Yeah.
Right. So I carried that in for decades. So if I wasn't worth protecting, what was my value? Well, my value then is outside, right? My value is acceptance. I became a people pleaser because I wanted to be valued by other people. So I went out of my way to make sure everybody liked me, right?
Yeah.
So
I was the opposite, and recently I realized this. There's so many different layers of healing, right?
Yeah.
And God knows, or even if you're not religious or you're not spirit filled, it's like there's always different layers. That's why you should constantly, often you should look inside of you and be like, okay, well, what's next? Is there anything else that I'm dealing with? But for me, I just realized that I was kind of the opposite of you, right? I had pain from everyone around me, that instead of trying to become a people pleaser, I was a secluded person. And I talk about in my book where I had this tree of anger that blossomed when I was a kid. And it was a protection. It was kind of like protecting me from the heat, from the sun, my dad's anger, that kind of thing. And then I took that tree and I cut it down when I was probably in junior high. And from that tree of safety, I created a shield. And what are shields? Shields can both be weapons and protection. And so that shield, when someone got too close to my pain or got too close to me and I felt exposed, I would use it to, make sure they couldn't get close enough. And then I would use it whenever I needed somebody to realize I was there, or needed somebody to realize that was a pain point for me. I would use the shield to hurt them, right? Mm-hmm. To hit them, to get their attention, to realize. And then when I was in high school, when me and my dad's relationship blew up, we had probably 6 years that we didn't talk after this, but I realized that I could take that shield and I could form it into a weapon, a sword, right? You can do defense and attack with a sword. And so I took that tree of safety, made it into a shield, and then turned it into a weapon. And oftentimes men do that, I think, from all the kind of conversations I've had. And so then I started using that to manipulate people, and I started using that to direct my life in the way that I wanted it to go.
Right.
Until I realized that I wasn't true to myself.
Yeah.
And it kind of, I call it rock bottom. I hit rock bottom, and I've hit rock bottom 3 or 4 times in my life. And when you hit rock bottom, it's such a painful thing, but it's such a great place where your spirit and soul are kind of sitting there. And it's like, where do I go from here?
Yeah.
And so for me, I didn't want anyone around. I didn't care for anybody. I was my own protector. So that's why I wielded it into a sword, because I needed to protect me. My dad never protected me. My mom didn't protect me. My brothers and sisters didn't protect me. I protected myself. And then I had such a sexual traumatic past that the only thing in my mind that I've never failed at was sex, and it started from, I don't know how deep we can go. I don't want to get too deep, but
whatever you want. Okay. We're good.
So, I talk about when I was raped as a kid, that experience kind of formed my sexual view through my life. Mm-hmm. And that started, it was me and actually another little girl. And we were being abused by somebody that was at our babysitter's house. And I didn't want her to go through the pain of what it was. So I threw myself in front of her oftentimes because I knew I could absorb it, right? I knew I could absorb the pain. I knew I could, protect her. And by doing that, it kind of put this identity in me, or this lie about my identity, where I got most of my comfort, peace, where I felt like I protected people from my sexuality.
Yeah.
And so from that point, I lost my virginity at 9 years old. I, started watching porn at 7, and, I lived my life where I was so consumed by sexuality, because anytime I needed to feel good enough, I would go and I would find, a lady or whatever, and I would put my trust and my belief of who I am in that. And so, it's all fine and dandy until you realize that that's a really tough thing to put your identity into.
That's right.
And I struggled with homosexuality when I got into high school, and had to work through all of that. And, that's such a hard thing as a man to deal with, because it's so shame-based. When you have to do something in the dark and you have to worry about that whole situation and dealing with that, it's so painful, and it's a prison in itself. Mm-hmm. And so...
And this because of your work with guys, is that this is a lot more common.
Oh, yeah.
That's why I appreciate you going there, because it is a lot more common where guys medicate with sexual things, more than sexuality, right? It's just the behavior, and you were talking earlier about making it into a sword. We can weaponize our pain. Yeah, and so often that weapon is turned against ourselves, yeah. Right? And so I know what you're talking about is there's it's dangerous kind of to talk about it, and yet it's so important, for men to say, hey, here's this guy who is being raw and real, and I just want men who are watching this to be encouraged that there really is tremendous hope. But you have to be willing to examine your life, right? And then come to an honest appraisal of your life. And then step into, intentionality, live with intentionality. The other day, a good friend of mine who, he's an engineer, and he asked the question, he says, what is being intentional.
Yeah.
And so there's a group of us there, and we were kind of going back and forth. And then I'm going to paraphrase his definition, but he said, is wanting something bad enough to create a plan and then execute that plan.
Yeah, for sure.
And I love that, because that's really what everything we're doing with Next Third Best Third and everything you're doing is about, is to encourage men to say, hey, dig down deep and have an honest appraisal of your life, and then create a plan to get through it, right?
Yeah.
And then execute that plan.
Yeah,
and a big part of that is being honest, being vulnerable, and associating yourself with other men.
Correct. Yeah, I always tell guys that I meet with, where it's to get on the other side of trauma and pain in your life and to go from silence to liberation, it takes massive intentionality and massive action.
Mm-hmm.
And so that for me is kind of what I live by. It's like massive intentionality and massive action.
Yeah.
And so, and that's how I've gotten to where I'm at now, is I realize that, and instead of putting it off, or instead of allowing the pain points of my life to run me, I had to stop, like you said, have introspection, dig deep, and realize that I'm in control of my life.
Yeah.
And it's all about who you give, right? You're in control of your life, but you're every day handing the key to your life to something or somebody.
Yeah.
And to me, I've tried all the different doors, right? I had a massive drug addiction from the age 14. After my sister was killed, the last words I ever said to my sister was, I hate you and I hope you die. And I used my anger weapon that week. She came up the next morning, because she was actually living with us at the time, and she had to go to school because she was going to take her finals, because she had a daughter, 18 months. I took her out on a walk, and I came home, and my sister was angry, and she's like, where'd you take my daughter? And I was like, we went down to Dairy Queen, and I got angry because I got so offensive, because I was like, hey, I was helping you. But what I realized is, now that I'm a father, I'm like, where's my son? Like, where'd you take him?
Right. Right.
It's like, I need to know, because I need to protect him. I need to just know. And so I remember, I walked in a room, and we were fighting and arguing, and I said, I hate you and I hope you die. And the next morning, because I was so angry, and I allowed my anger to control me, it controlled my relationship, right? It controlled my life, because I gave it the key to my life. Mm-hmm. And so she came up, was knocking on my door. Hey, Trevor, I want to talk before I leave. Will you come talk to me? And I ignored her, because I was like, no, like, she can live in her, wanting to apologize and kind of the pain of that. And so I manipulated myself. And so she left and went off to college, and she was there 5 days. And she would call me every day and leave me a message. And I wouldn't call her back. And I'm like, no, we can talk when she gets back this weekend. And so Friday comes. She's supposed to come back on Saturday or Thursday. And I get a call from her, and I felt in my heart, I was like, man, I should answer this. But I let it go to voicemail. And then I was at a doctor's appointment, so I turned my phone off, and I was driving home, and I saw these two cops flying by, like, quick. And I was like, man, something, got this feeling in my gut, and this is before I met the Lord, But I got a feeling in my gut. Now I would say discernment, but I remember looking to my other sister, and I was like, something bad happened to our family. This was like an hour and a half away from my house. My sister's like, what do you mean? I was like, I don't know, I just have a bad feeling in my gut. And so we drive back. About an hour later, we get into our town. I lived on the kind of the middle to end of this road that's a straight stretch, and you could see my house from when you turn on the road. And I see those two cop cars in there, and I remember the length and time that it took for me and my sister to get there. And I remember pulling up, and I get out, and this cop walks over to me, and he's like, are you Trevor? I'm like, yeah. And he goes, he like didn't know what to say, and I was like, what's up? And he's like, you should talk to your aunt. And my aunt was there, which was kind of weird. And I remember when I got out of the car, now that I look back on it, I remember kind of this roar in the background, on the backside of my house that was kind of, I didn't know what it was when I got out of the car, but I walk up, my aunt gives me a hug, and she's like, Trevor, your sister was killed in a car accident today. Sorry. And I remember her telling me that, and I didn't know how to comprehend it. I was like, okay. And I walked down, and I had this carport. My mom and dad's cars were there, and I remember seeing my mom in the fetal position on the ground, and she was bawling, and she was saying, why, God? And I remember just walking by her, and I'm like, this is weird, I walked to my back porch, and this is the first time I ever saw my dad cry. I was 14, and I walked on our back deck, and I looked into his room, sliding glass doors, and I see him sitting there on the corner of his bed, and he's bawling. Sorry.
It's all right.
But he was saying the same thing. He said, why, God? Why is this happening to our family again? And I turned around and I sat on the back deck. My legs were over the side. And I was sitting there, and I remember I felt somebody put their hands on my shoulders. And I heard the audible voice. Now what I feel was God. And it said, everything's going to be okay.
Yeah.
And I had this peace come over me, and I looked around, and I was like, man, that was weird. Like, I thought I was just delusional or something.
Right.
And I turned my phone back on, and I got a message. And I listened to the message, and it was my sister. And she was like, hey, Trevor, I love you. I'm excited to see you. I'm sorry for how I treated you, and I don't want this to be how it ends. And then my sister was full of life.
Yeah.
And she started talking about how she was so happy, about herself, proud of herself because she changed her flat tire and all that. And I the message in, and I called her back because at this point it still hadn't hit me. I called her back, and I was just like, I love you, and I'm excited to see you. And I hung up the phone. But I remember I say all that because I remember that pain in my life created this platform for me to either give my key to something that gave me peace or give my key to something that gave me temporary comfort.
Yeah, that's so
and
good.
3 weeks after that, that's when I started a severe drug addiction. And I gave my key to something that gave me temporary comfort, not realizing that it'll take everything from you.
Yeah.
And that's oftentimes what happens to people. They don't realize it, is they
Right.
grab it in the moment that they need it.
Yeah.
And they don't realize it's going to take everything. And so I had a bad pill addiction for 3.5 years, turned into heroin. And then luckily I got really sick when I did that. And I switched to methamphetamine and cocaine, and I had a serious methamphetamine and cocaine addiction for about 7 years. And it took everything from me. It took my house, took my college, dropped out of college, I was homeless on the streets. And I was consumed by that because I gave my key to that. And the moment that I realized was the day I met my wife, Claire. I owe her my life. Sorry.
No, it's good.
She was the first person that I was vulnerable with. Told her everything. Told her my life, told her my drug addiction, told her the things I struggle with. And she looked at me and she said, "You're loved."
Yeah.
But through that changed my life, and it made me realize that you have to be vulnerable to be able to take the key of your life back. And for me, thank God, I met Jesus.
Yeah.
And I got to give the creator that created my life and created my destiny and my purpose for who I am, the key back to my life.
I so appreciate your vulnerability and you being here, because I really believe that you bring hope. You carry hope, and so many people, men, women alike, need hope at all different ages. What's exciting is I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about your family and those two boys, 5 and 2, that you have changed the course of their life, right? Oh. You've changed the course of your life by you being intentional and by you giving getting your identity straight and walking in it. And I'm just so encouraged. Your book, you said that you call it 8 pieces of art.
Yeah.
And I love that, because once you get his book, and again, we're going to have the link for how you can get it. I was just so impressed is not even the right word, but I was so touched, because it is, you use poetry.
Yeah.
And then you go in and you talk about you break it down, and you really bring us on this journey that you're doing right now, but you bring us on this journey through your healing. And it is, it's just so impactful.
Yeah.
Because it's so real.
Yeah. I intentionally call it art, because I feel like our life is a masterpiece, each of our lives. Mm-hmm. And Broken for a Purpose came out of me realizing that all the pieces we have in our life, God takes them and He forms them and shapes them into this beautiful masterpiece that unlocks people. And God uses our relationships intentionally. He knows exactly what you've been through, what I've been through, and He uses our broken parts to create this masterpiece, to where when we see somebody, it's like a lens, right? When we see somebody that has walked through the things we walk through, we're the breakthrough for them, because we can connect with them and talk to them. And so I call it art, because I believe that we're all a masterpiece. And I believe, I created the book that way because my main goal is to get it into prisons and get it into rehab facilities and sane asylums and those kind of things, to where, when I was an addict, I never just sat down and read a whole book. But I was always weirdly captivated by short pieces and artwork, where it made my mind really come alive and think about, like, what is this person saying?
Right.
And so I created the book to where you can read it from front to back and it makes sense. Or you can look at the book like I did, read the back, I'm intrigued by it, and then open and look at all the titles and go, found at rock bottom. I wonder what that talks about. Yeah. And so someone can open it to my 5th chapter or my 8th chapter, and they can read it and they can get something just from reading that one piece. Yeah. And so poetry, I'm not a poet, or I didn't think I was. But that's just how God allowed my pain and stuff to kind of come out and be in front of me. Yeah. I
love that.
It's interesting and intriguing, but I know that I wrote it that way for a reason.
Yeah. And it's so good. And it's interesting. The more that we talk, the more I find that we have similarities. I love to write, but I love writing short stories.
Yeah.
So I'm working on my 2nd book right now called Legacy. And that's what made me think about your legacy that you're leaving behind. But one of the great messages that you're sharing, and we've talked about this on Next Third, Best Third, is that your pain and your brokenness and your wounds and your failures do not disqualify you. No. Rather, they uniquely qualify you. Yeah, because this is redemption. You being able to share from your vulnerable, broken past, right, and being real, you're able to bring hope to men. You're able to bring inspiration, and that is just such a power, and it's so needed. Yeah. Right? It is so needed in this world today, and I so appreciate you. So this has been really great.
Yeah, can I just say one more thing?
You bet.
I think and I think I shared this with you in the men's group on Saturday, or with the other gentleman, but two things that completely changed my perspective on my pain is I was at a retreat or something, and someone looked at me and said, God doesn't call the qualified, but he qualifies the called.
Yeah.
And so that made me realize that if I'm called, like Scripture says I am, and if I believe that God created me for a purpose, then he's the one that's going to lift me up. He's the one that's going to form me and shape me. And then it really kind of was engraved in me when my pastor, currently at the church I go to in Nashville, he said, what God doesn't prevent, he will always redeem.
Mm-hmm.
And so that made me really start to think about my life and the pain and everything that I've been through, kind of like you, where all of that, maybe not that God called it or caused it, but he uses that to shape exactly what you need to be freedom for people, to be freedom for the earth, right?
Yeah.
And so it's just so fascinating when you can get a mindset that you're not just your past, you're not just your
That's right.
pain and everything you said, but that through God's redemption and through a pure relationship, it can be created into what your purpose truly can be.
There's a scripture, and again, there's a lot of people here who don't share our faith, but there's a scripture in Jeremiah where Jeremiah is the prophet, and he goes down to the potter's house. Yeah. And as he's looking at the potter working, and you're talking about a masterpiece, here's a master potter, and he's creating a vessel. And then the scripture says that it gets marred in the potter's hand, right? So here's a master potter, and for some reason, the piece that he's molding gets marred. It's not the master's fault. It's not even the piece's fault. It's just life. Yeah. You know, my brother is a potter, and he's told me about how the environment, like where the clay came from, the humidity in the room, the how hard you work that clay, that the clay itself has some elements to it, right, that either make it appropriate or not, you know, and it can get marred. But then it goes on and says that the master potter does not throw the clay away, but he reforms it into a new piece that seems best to him. Yeah, and that's your life.
It's awesome.
So good.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, thanks for being here. This is so good. And for all of you, thanks for being here. The link below for his book, Broken for a Purpose, is going to be there. And I really appreciate you if you would share this, if you would like it, subscribe. This is a message that so many people, men and women alike, need to hear, but really specifically men of all ages, that there is hope in your pain, there's hope in your brokenness, and the things that you're struggling with, they don't define you, but they can be totally redeemed and totally transformed. Thanks again.